How empires really pay for war. Every empire in history eventually runs into the same problem. War is expensive. Armies, weapons, supplies, infrastructure, and political control all cost massive amounts of money. Yet empires almost never stop fighting simply because they run out of cash. Instead, they invent new financial tricks to keep the machine running. That pattern repeats across history, from ancient Rome to modern America. Rome, destroying the value of money. At first, the Roman Empire grew rich through conquest. New territories meant more taxes, more slaves, more resources, and more treasure flowing into Rome. But eventually expansion slowed down. The empire still had to pay soldiers, maintain roads, fund government officials, and defend enormous borders. Expenses stayed high even when new wealth stopped coming in. So Rome changed the money itself. Roman leaders began reducing the silver content in their coins while keeping the same official value. The coin looked identical on the outside, but it contained less real silver than before. This was one of history's earliest forms of currency debasement. At first it seemed harmless, but over time people realized the money was losing value. Prices rose, trust collapsed, soldiers demanded higher pay. Inflation spread through the empire. When governments can't honestly afford their spending, they often reduce the value of money instead. Spain, wealth built on debt. After conquering parts of the Americas, Spain gained enormous amounts of gold and silver from places like Mexico and Peru. On paper, Spain looked unstoppable. But instead of building a stable economy, Spain borrowed heavily against future shipments of silver. The empire spent money before it actually arrived. Spain financed wars across Europe using massive loans, assuming the treasure flow would continue forever. Didn't. When silver shipments slowed or military costs exploded, Spain repeatedly went bankrupt, despite appearing to be the richest empire in the world. Ironically, the flood of silver also caused major inflation across Europe. More money entered the system, but real productivity didn't increase at the same pace. The result was economic instability hiding behind the illusion of wealth. Britain, power through trust. Britain took a different approach. Instead of weakening its currency, Britain built a financial system designed around trust and long-term borrowing. Institutions like the Bank of England and government bond markets allowed Britain to raise huge amounts of money efficiently. Investors trusted that Britain would repay its debts with interest. Because of that trust, the British government could borrow enormous sums at relatively low rates. This became one of Britain's greatest strategic advantages. While rival nations often struggled to fund long wars, Britain transformed future tax revenue into immediate military power. It could finance conflicts for far longer than most competitors. But the system still came with a cost. Eventually, taxpayers and ordinary citizens carried the burden through taxes, inflation, and national debt. World wars, printing money at scale. The First World War changed global finance forever. Governments abandoned many of the old restrictions tied to gold-backed currencies and began printing massive amounts of paper money to fund war efforts. The financial consequences lasted long after the fighting ended. Debt exploded. Inflation surged. Entire economies became unstable. In countries like Germany, hyperinflation destroyed savings and devastated the middle class. People watched the value of their money collapse almost overnight. War doesn't just consume resources in the present. It borrows from the future, often with interest. The United States, the power of the dollar. After World War II, the United States emerged as the world's dominant economic power. The global financial system created after the war placed the US dollar at the center of international trade and finance. This changed everything. Rome weakened coins. Spain borrowed against silver. Britain sold bonds. America built a system where its own debt became one of the world's most trusted assets. Because global trade, reserves, and financial markets rely heavily on the dollar, the United States can borrow enormous amounts in its own currency while continuing to run large deficits. That level of financial flexibility is historically unique. But it also creates risk. When governments believe debt has no real limit, spending expands faster than discipline. The system continues functioning as long as global trust remains strong. The limit may not disappear, it may simply be delayed. The real lesson, the biggest lesson isn't just about empires. It's about ordinary people. Financial freedom does not depend only on income. It also depends on how exposed you are to government decisions, inflation, and monetary policy. When governments print money aggressively or take on massive debt, the hidden cost often falls on savers, workers, retirees, and the middle class. Inflation